We want to thank her so much for being here today to share her insights about online teaching. Dr. J.Y. Sung, as a pianist, has received numerous awards, including, as she mentioned earlier, the fellowship from APA, as well as the Pro Musicus International Award. She also has a critically acclaimed recording of the Debussy Etudes. As a teacher, she's been on faculty at Manus for 20 years, over 20 years.
Long time.
Um, yeah,
Fly.
very long time. Um, and what makes her so fantastic as a model for the music entrepreneur is her activities in entrepreneurship and innovation. She teaches the class still, I think, right, at Juilliard, the leadership and innovation class. And while on faculty at Manus, she went back to school, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, of course, but she went back to school to get an MBA from NYU to realize her dream of creating ToneRow, which is a online teaching platform. And so she's the founder and CEO of ToneRow since 2012, 2014, or
Yeah, I think we launched to the broader public around that time, 2014.
okay, yeah. So way before COVID, way before online teaching became fashionable. Let's give Dr. Song a virtual round of applause to show our thanks for her taking the time to be here. Um, I don't know if you want to say anything, JY.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's such a pleasure to be here, and it's really an honor. It's lovely to see you, Tim, again. It's been a few years, and I remember your gorgeous performances at Chautauqua, so I'm very, very happy to see you again in this context. Um, but yes, I think the environment currently, particularly for the last 8 months, has put a spotlight on online teaching in a way that I never expected, right? And it is an area that I've been thinking about and working on for quite a number of years. And I wouldn't. I don't know how well, and perhaps some of you can give your experience as well, but how well people have taken to this medium, right? And I think in some ways it's still a little bit of a necessity, right? I think we're all in a situation where we need to give lessons online. At the same time, I think it provides incredible benefits, right? So I'm sure we'll go into a lot more detail about all of those things. But I think it would be very interesting to me to understand, what some of the challenges you faced, as you transitioned to this online medium. If there's any way I can be helpful, more than happy to talk about that as well. It's obviously a medium that I feel very comfortable in, and that I have always enjoyed thinking about the benefits. So I don't see it at all as sort of a lesser medium. It's certainly a different medium, but I think it certainly has its advantages. So yeah, so I'll let you take the lead, Tim, and
Excellent.
go into more
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And if anyone would like to ask questions as we're going along, please feel free to unmute yourselves or type questions in the chat, and I'll try my best to multitask and read them. Um, I think I like the idea of maybe starting by sharing some experiences that we've had over the past few months with online teaching. So for me, it was kind of my first I kind of got thrown into it like a lot of people in the spring semester where we were teaching in person. I remember even my students saying, "Oh, we're going to go online next week," and I'm like, "No, that'll never happen." And so I have big group classes, and then all of a sudden we're given a week, 2 weeks to just redo our entire curriculum to try to do it. Through as best we can for students who maybe don't have keyboards, don't have good Wi-Fi, don't have a lot of things. Um, so that was kind of my trial by fire, and learning over the past summer has been really interesting. A lot of experience doing by failing, I guess, or learning by failing, I should say, was a lot of it. And so I was curious, JY, if for you, since you've been doing this for so long, is this kind of business as usual for you, or did you have to make a lot of adjustments this year since March?
Well, Actually, I would say probably the greater adjustments were more on the lecture side, right? Because it's true, one gets used to talking to a classroom and engaging in interacting with students in that format. And all of a sudden online, I think the requirements are slightly different. You know, I do think planning plays a bigger role online, somehow being extremely organized, doing a lot of the planning ahead of time, you know, sort of communicating as clearly as possible and all the time with the students, you know, what are we going to be doing next, you know, having clear course planning for the entire hour or the 2 hours, however the case may be. I think that those aspects, I think, ended up taking a lot of time to think about upfront. As far as the lessons go, it's true I had been giving lessons for a few years prior to that, so it was a fairly smooth transition to giving lessons online. I would say one of the challenges was more on the student side, making sure that they were properly equipped. And also, as I've experienced over the years, just that initial resistance to conducting this central activity that we do in an online format, you know. And I think over the years I've had many conversations with musicians, and several love the possibilities but don't believe in the current situation that it's easily adaptable or sufficiently adaptable for the needs of a musician. So I think there was a lot of convincing along the way, and I gave my share of webinars back in March and April, trying to help people with the proper setup, getting the right equipment. And I think my advice today is very much the same. I'm sure all of you are extremely experienced now, so I don't know that it's helpful to go through those types of steps, but I would say I think underlying all of that is that simplicity is really key. You know, I think I never set it up in such a way that it looked like a recording studio, you know, that somehow I had microphone stands coming out of every corner and switching cameras, you know, every few minutes. I think all of that really complicates the central issue, which is really about that communication between the student and the teacher, and how to maintain that trust, how to build that trust if you're dealing with a new person, right? And your first and only interaction is online. So by this semester, I have quite a few students I have never met in person, right? And somehow, as a teacher, one has to find ways to establish that trust so that learning can happen comfortably. So at the end of the day, you know, technology is simply a tool, I think, by and large. It enables us in extraordinary ways, and I think we see that during this time, right? If COVID had happened 5 years ago, we would be in a much worse place than we are right now, right? I think it simply would have been extraordinarily difficult to conduct lessons and classes at a high level the way it's certainly very possible today. But I think all of that very much serves as a tool to maintain and, you know, to make it meaningful, this interaction that we have, you know, between teachers and students.
That's fantastic. I love the idea that the planning ahead. That's something I definitely have noticed. The first few lessons for me when I didn't do that, no, stark contrast to what I'm doing now. I think you touched on this already, but the attitude of many this year is that online teaching is a necessity, but not the ideal situation. So we're kind of pining for that ideal and kind of, you know, making do with what we have. So I was wondering, as someone who has advocated for online teaching long before this pandemic, do you think that that this attitude is appropriate, or does online teaching offer its own set of merits and opportunities?
Yeah,
And what might those be? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think in the early stages, the primary benefit is just one of access, right? And I think, again, in this current COVID situation, that's what we're mostly confronted with, is that we can reach people halfway around the world whom we could not reach otherwise, right? And I think that's been a central benefit of many technologies that we've adopted in music, you know, whether it's recordings. The whole purpose of recordings in the early days was to have people not in the hall hear a performance, however poor those early recordings may have been, right? They were very pale representations of what happened in the concert hall, very noisy, very scratchy, and yet people still engage with it because all of a sudden 10,000 people are listening halfway around the world to that recording. And so reaching a new population has always been one of the central benefits of adopting new technologies. The internet, when it came around, was extremely dramatic, right? The fact that we can communicate in real time with people all around the world, I think that's truly been one of the extraordinary benefits. So I think that part, I think we all understand, and I think that's important. But I would say beyond that, the fact that many of these lessons and lectures are recorded, there's a certain repetition and analytical quality to recordings. I think that exists over and above that transient in-person contact, right? And it's true that when we meet in person, as in, let's say, something like live concerts, we're looking for that inspiration of the moment, right? That, things that may occur spontaneously. I think online, alongside with the greater planning, is the fact that we can study oneself more, right? And I think there are huge benefits, and I've observed this already this semester, right, where students review the lessons every week, right? And it's not just reminding themselves of what may have been said in the lesson, but they observe themselves playing, right? And they observe themselves, even speaking, but certainly, watching themselves perform. And that repeated contact with one's own performances, I think, is extraordinarily transforming. I think it develops greater self-awareness. They don't rely, in fact, as much on somebody else telling them this is what's happening, right? They can see for themselves. And we all do that normally, that's true. And even in person, some students do record lessons. But I would say it's not as sustained a process as it is now, right? Now, truly on a weekly basis, students are engaging in that kind of self-reflection and self-observation, which leads to much more rapid growth. But I would say beyond that as well, I think in terms of just the technicality of the online medium, one thing I've been doing quite a bit in particularly my lecture classes, where there are multiple people, are grouping students in smaller breakout rooms, as they're called on Zoom. And I think that also has helped to draw out students in different ways, right? So I think when we're all in one large session, whether it's in the classroom or in one big Zoom call such as this one, there are certain people who tend to dominate the conversation, right? People who enjoy speaking. And one thing that I've observed online is that in some ways some people do communicate more easily in more intimate settings, right? And we all know people who are more introverted perhaps have extremely thoughtful things to say, but may not always be the first ones to jump in and speak up. So by breaking up these sizes, right, even encouraging students to meet in their own breakout session, where they might feel less put upon to speak, right? And even in situations where I'm not there, right, the teacher may not be there. So in a breakout session, perhaps they meet on their own, right? Then they're much more able to bring their ideas out. So I would say even in those situations, I like to plan around it, right? And it's very clear what they are tasked with accomplishing during the breakout session. What is it that they should be discussing primarily, right? And then to always have an ask on the exit, right? So by the end of these 15 minutes, I would like you to speak on these subjects, right? To answer these questions based on your discussion. And in most cases, I also designate a coordinator for that breakout session so that one person knows they need to keep track of the discussion, and they're the ones who then will be sharing that information with us. So this was one way to get students to participate in ways that are not easy to accomplish in a larger setting, right? And it's more structured. Students know exactly what is expected of them, and then instead of calling on someone who may not be prepared to speak, the coordinator knows that he or she will be expected to speak and therefore can prepare. So it's little things like this, which actually, interestingly, really is not easy to do in real life, because if you're in one classroom with 15 people, 20 people, there's no physical space where I can say, okay, 3 of you go there, 2 of you go there, and come back with your comments, right? And so in this kind of situation, it can be very spontaneous. It can be relatively brief, right? It could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes. If it's a more extensive conversation, it could be longer, right? So it's infinitely malleable, right? One can adapt it to different situations. So I would say the sort of repeated use in different situations of breakout rooms has been extremely helpful. So yeah, I think that on multiple levels, I think there are two broader aspects in terms of where the technology can help. One is how does it influence the content of what we do, right? How does it impact what we say and how we say it, right? And the other aspect is simply these additional tools, like let's say a breakout room, and how can that slowly allow new ideas to percolate, right? Or new types of interactions, or bring forward a new population of students who may not otherwise be engaged, right? So I think in those two areas there have been quite significant steps that are possible online.
Fantastic, yeah. And I loved what you said about students having the ability to listen to themselves after the lesson. That's something that I kind of took from in-person lessons and also am doing as a teacher. So now that I'm teaching online, I can record my lessons and see how I'm interacting with my students through a screen, which I found is very different. At the very beginning, I found that I might have joined some sort of circus because I was so engaged overdoing it to try to make up for the lack of uh, physical distance. And so that's one of the things is, I realized that once I started teaching online, I couldn't really rely on those in-person strategies as much. And you kind of touched on this already with, simplicity is key, but I was wondering if you have any other important um, things that virtual music teachers should consider as they're developing these sort of new pedagogical approaches for online education.
Okay, so I mean, actually, tied to that is in part the tech piece, and I'm actually curious if anyone still feels that there are some challenges in terms of music. So I think one of the big questions with online with relating to music is really that question of sound, and I think that's the reason why certainly in the early days of online lessons, so many musicians sort of had reservations about this. So I think we all understand that it works very well for speaking and for lectures and things of this nature. And many of these platforms are specifically adapted to that purpose, right? But I think for musicians, we have this added challenge of, how do we perceive subtleties in sound, right? Subtle shifts in color. And so are those, I mean, I'm happy to share perhaps just an excerpt of some of a class that I gave this past week. I teach one course, piano literature at Manus. It's for early keyboard through early classical period, and sometimes in order to demonstrate, I set it up very much like a piano lesson. So, and I think one of the priorities from very early days, of us all teaching online was to make sure the sound is as good as it can be. Again, understanding that we're not all functioning in a sound studio, right? And so, perhaps just by way of example, and again, maybe this will prompt people to have questions about this. So let me see if I can. So. This was one class this past week, so maybe just hear a little bit. So this is the end of the piece, but he adds a coda. Very ornamented. Again, and then very dynamic. Orchestra introduction. And again, the surprise, right? So this is so Mozart as well, that not only has he added this coda, but now he's adding this beautiful ending, right? Discreetly, and we end in a calm place. And so you know, I picked a sort of a segment where the music is more delicate, and you know, I think so. Part of the subject of this course is really trying to understand style, right? What is Mozart's style versus, let's say, you know, other composers, and so we end up covering quite a lot of repertoire in person. Students play, I play, and so on. And so, you know, again, having a situation where one can speak clearly into the camera, right, and have students interact with you in a frontal way, and then also hearing the piano sound well, I think that's been one of the great challenges, I think, particularly for pianists, right? We face one way to do one thing, face another to do another. But anyway, I'm curious to know what you think of the sound, and if this is something that you is familiar in terms of your own setups.
If anyone wants to chime in, please do. No, nobody plays piano here.
I see. Okay, all right. Also, perhaps that's overly narrow of a consideration, but I would say, you know, if one can find a good setup for the piano, it usually works for almost any other situation, because it's just, I think the dynamic range of the instrument is so enormous, you know, from one note to many notes, and then just the unmovability of this large instrument, right? You can't just bring the instrument somewhere. You have to move the camera and place everything accordingly. So I think there are very specific challenges around, you know, recording the piano as an instrument. But in any case, you know, just very quickly, you know, the setup for this was a simple microphone. Perhaps I'll stop screen sharing, but you know, it's just this one that I'm still using now. Right, and it's a USB microphone. There's nothing more than that. And then a laptop, a Mac laptop, and I'm using just the webcam from the laptop itself. Right, so it's an extremely simple setup. I just have it up on a stand. I would say one area that does make a huge difference is just Wi-Fi speed. Right, and so I always connect my laptop to an Ethernet cord. Right, I don't trust the Wi-Fi necessarily to be stable, and it also reduces lag to have an Ethernet cord. So I go through the trouble each and every time, before every lecture, before every lesson, to make sure the setup is good, right? I connect the Ethernet, I connect the microphone, I restart the computer, I make sure there are no bugs, you know, and I think one of the toughest things, you know, in this setup is if there are disruptions, it's very disruptive to the flow of the lesson. Right, so I try very hard to make sure that things run absolutely smoothly during the lesson. I don't want to be restarting my laptop halfway through, dealing with noises and things of that nature. So it does take always at least, you know, 15 minutes ahead of time, right, to make sure everything is properly organized. But I would say sound was really a big deal, and I think, you know, once the students had their setup done comfortably on their end. You know, many had to acquire microphones, many had to experiment also, as you said, you know, with their own situations. Many had to improve their Wi-Fi, right? And then purchase, you know, the $10 Ethernet cord, make sure, and then the adapter, of course, because no laptops now have an Ethernet plug anymore, so you have to get that as well. But these little things, none of them are a big deal, right? They're all easily, you know, put together. So then the lessons could take place, you know, extremely comfortably. And I feel in many ways there's really almost no gap, right? There's no real distance there. So, you know, again, I feel the transition was quite smooth, you know, in terms of moving online. And I also feel, you know, that one can be very communicative through this medium, right? I think there's a certain presence with the camera being right on the person, right? You're actually really quite close. There are a few distractions around, you know, that you might have in a room situation, right? And so I've had very little difficulty with just keeping people's attention that way. I don't feel that students are losing focus, that they tune out, that they turn off their laptop in frustration and don't want to talk to me anymore. I mean, it just seems very easy to manage. So yeah. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts around the sound again, the sound quality and those types of questions. If they've struggled with any of that, or if it's been hard to get a stable sound, or if you feel like you just don't quite hear the sound well enough to teach or to receive the lessons properly?
Well, one of my struggles was that like microphones can be expensive, and I can't possibly, require my secondary piano students to purchase a microphone for, a lesson that they are only going to be in for a semester. And they also don't feel like it's worth it. So a lot of the times I find myself having them pre-recorded and then send it to me, or having to like fill in the gaps of what I think they sound like. And I feel like I've gotten really good at that, but I feel like that's also not the most effective way to teach.
Right. So have you, do you generally listen to the recordings ahead of time or you listen to it together through screen sharing?
I listen ahead of time and with them.
I see. Okay. So that's another process that have found extremely helpful, particularly in recent weeks, because a lot of the application deadlines were around December 1st. So I had quite a few students preparing videos for applications. And so one thing that we did this fall, particularly with those students, was from October, right? Every week I asked them to make a video of one of the pieces, and the first part of the lesson would be through screen sharing, right? So I would listen to the video, and the sound quality is very good through screen sharing. I don't know if that's your experience as well, but I generally find that you can hear almost like a regular recording, right? There's no obstruction from it being over the Wi-Fi signals. So, and again, so what this did was several fold. One is that it trained them to make video recordings on a repeated basis for a long time before they make the actual application video. And that's something, again, in real life we rarely do. We rarely have that luxury. Nobody has the time. They're too busy practicing to actually make a recording. And now, because it was integrated into the lesson, by the time they made the actual recording, it was just one more day doing the same thing that they've been doing for 2 months, right? But again, that sense that in the lesson itself, I could stop, in minute places, right, and constantly confront the student with his or her own playing. And so it's not just me telling them after the fact, this is what it sounds like, perhaps you want to think about this, but in the moment, right, they can see themselves play, they're not busy playing themselves, and they can really focus on what is being discussed. So again, these are things that I would love, in fact, to integrate into real life lessons, but it may not always be that easy, right? And we all do it to some degree. In the past, sometimes I ask them to bring a recording, but it's just hard to do on a regular basis. So what I expect to see moving forward increasingly are ways in which what we learn now will be integrated more and more into our day-to-day. I mean, I had no doubt from the early days of online lessons that this was just going to become very much part of what we do, right? It's just one more of the tools that we have at our disposal to reach a student and get a student to improve, because ultimately that's the goal, right? We're all trying to encourage a student to reach another level in their playing, right? And however that gets done, right, is a good method. And so we don't need to get bogged down in technology for that to happen, but I think there are many ways in which we can use this so that that process can happen more rapidly, right, and more efficiently in some ways, right, and I think that's all good, and all of this has nothing to do with access at a long distance, right? All of this has to do simply with the pedagogy itself. How does one get somebody to reach a level that even he or she may not have thought possible, right? And I think these are all extremely valuable tools.
I have a quick question here. First of all, I just want to say how fantastic
Hi,
it is
Alan.
to have you. It's really, really great to see you.
Yes,
Really, very,
likewise.
very special. And thank you so much, everybody, for organizing this really spectacular conversation. Really, just wonderful. I have a question that leans into the whole idea of changing behavior, with different technologies and different technologies becoming part of our lives. If you think of the way that we used to use a telephone, for instance, and the way that we now use our mobile devices, and how, everything that's in a mobile device now is part of a world of communication that we never imagined possible when we were just using the telephone, right? And we seem to be going through a similar situation right now with performance and performance practice and behavior associated to technology. And various technologies that we have around us, including the piano, right? If you think of the piano as being sort of in some form of technology. Um, and this is a question for you in terms of what you've seen happening over not just the last 6 8 months, but what's really been happening over the last 10 years. Is there is do you what are the themes that you see come through in terms of how people's um, approach to the artistry is shifting?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I think that's what, in some ways, we all grapple with in schools, right? Trying to understand the future direction of the education that we provide, and I think because of the fact that we all have integrated technology into our daily lives in such a deep way, right? In a way that simply was unimaginable when I was a kid growing up, right? I still had landlines and phones and so on. And now I can hardly wake up in the morning with my alarm without it coming from my smartphone, right? And one does everything around that as well. So I think it's been integrated in just our daily lives, our routines. And historically, our field has been quite resistant to technology, right? I think our ideal of sound is an acoustic sound. It's the sound that we hear in real life, the vibration through the air. And I think that's extremely important. At the same time, I can imagine all sorts of ways in which our mindset is also shifting, right? Because technology now is no longer a strange beast that sits on top of our activities. I think increasingly it's integrated into simply what we do. And right now, as far as online lessons are concerned, I can see how these are still very much baby steps. And as much as it has, I believe, saved us these last 8 months, right, it's still extremely basic in that we're trying to conduct lessons online the way we do them offline, right? And just like recording a concert at Carnegie Hall, let's say, the ideal would be to capture sound that was just as if we were there, right? We're not trying to alter anything as much as is possible. But I think ultimately, the benefit of online possibilities or of technology more broadly is that we can start shifting how we do things and start shifting how we think about things. And one of the ongoing topics, I'm sure, in any institution is how do we integrate technology more into our pedagogy and in how we do things, right? Not less. And in part because the younger generation just is plugged in, right? This is how they function. This is how they see the world, understand the world. And we cannot always remain strictly offline, right? And so as far as online lessons are concerned, I can see how over time other types of technologies will come into play. It could be augmented reality, it could be virtual reality, which these are things that are very much already in play, right? But maybe not specifically for lessons in a broad sense. But a couple years ago, I had spoken with somebody who was trying to work on stage through virtual reality, right? Because a lot of that has to do with shifting what we focus on in situations of stress, right? So the one reason we get nervous is because suddenly we go from a dark, comfortable, familiar practice room to a brightly lit stage with, air conditioning and an audience, and just the unfamiliarity of it all can be very disconcerting, and it makes it even more difficult to control one's nerves, to play in an environment that feels comfortable. So one thing that virtual reality can do is to recreate these conditions so that when we're faced with it, it doesn't seem so unfamiliar. It can also do the reverse, which is to have us imagine a calm environment, right? And so we associate performance with this calm environment. And then when we finally are on stage, what we really are thinking about is this beautiful, calm environment. We could imagine a field with the sun shining, and that's what we imagine as we play, instead of seeing sort of a nervous environment with audiences and people staring and so on and so forth. So I think those practices, can over time become very easily integrated into what we do. We already have backgrounds that we can recreate, right? So it's not such a stretch to imagine, all right, every time we have a lesson, we're on stage at Carnegie Hall, right? Just change your background, imagine that you're there, change the acoustics, right? And every time you play, you have that kind of projection, that kind of focus. You're trying to reach the back row of that hall, right? And you imagine that public, so that by the time you're on stage, for real, the public has always been there with you, right? You can even integrate coughing. There are many things one can do, right? And a lot of the training for a performer is not to get distracted in those situations. To play with it, to go with the flow. And the more comfortable you are, the easier it will be. So I don't see these at all as an impediment, right? Or as an artificial layer that one puts on top of what we normally do. I think they're all beneficial tools if one uses them well, right? I think that's really the key. But even beyond just these tools, I think more deeply on the creative side, I think that's one thing that we also all expect to see coming out of this period, is that people are getting more and more creative in terms of how they perform and what is an acceptable medium, right? And how to create interesting videos, right? How do you reach new audiences via creatively produced videos? Right. And in the early stages, I remember back in spring, I was teaching a chamber music course, specifically for duos. All of a sudden, we were all editing, right? And I'm sure all of you went through that as well, right? We go from, just focusing on how to play well together to suddenly, all right, you cut here, you cut there, and this is the better take, and we're going to try to synchronize all our parts, right? So suddenly what we were doing in the class was just radically different. But again, I would say, on the musical side, what was interesting is that it forced everyone to be absolutely clear on what they wanted to do musically. Right? You almost had to plan it ahead of time. Right? I'm going to slow down here, and then I'm going to do this, and I want to bring out this voice, so you come down less. And then in the recording, one could adjust accordingly. Right? So things that we just take for granted, you might just decide you're going to respond spontaneously in a live performance. Suddenly it took a lot more mental effort. And that process, I think, is a very important process, right? We want to know what we're going to play. So, but, again, by the end of that semester, some students had produced beautiful videos, right? The split screens, some also integrated other images, some were trying to think about, how is this music expressive and how can one add things to it visually that enhances the communication. Right? And it was essentially bringing live performance to our current situation in the 21st century in many ways, right? That we have all these tools at our disposal that we are not using. And yet these tools can allow us to reach new audiences, to find new forms of creativity, to collaborate with people halfway around the world we would never possibly meet, right? And these can generate very interesting works of art and very interesting performances. So I think increasingly, those types of ideas will become more and more integrated into our daily lives. And, and if, unfortunately, it took something like this to kind of spur it along and maybe accelerate it, but I saw that process happening regardless. I think many people did. So a lot of interesting developments that were simply moved forward in time, perhaps.
That's great. Thank you very much. I just quickly posted a link to Nare Sol. Do you know Nare?
No, I don't.
She's got an incredible YouTube channel, and she's a Juilliard trained pianist as well. And she is just doing incredible work by really getting into the whole technology side. And it's just fascinating to see what she's doing.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I'll take a look myself as well.
So I wondered if we could maybe circle back a little bit to some of the practical matters of teaching online. So we had one question that came in, which is talking about challenges that we face individually. And I think a lot of us here in this session are looking at teaching sort of a younger crowd, I should say, beginner, intermediate students. So the question was that the challenges that this person is having difficulty engaging their younger students virtually. And so I'm not sure if you have any advice for this person
Yeah.
There's a suggestion that perhaps asking parents to record practice sessions and reviewing those together might be a good idea. Possibly you might have some
Right.
other advice.
Yeah. I mean, I had an interesting experience many years ago when I was just starting to teach online, and I had a student who was about 12 years old, and her family then moved to California. And so, one of the ways in which the parents were trying to make it less disruptive was to start lessons online. So, thought, well, it's nice to have some continuity because her school is going to be different, her environment is going to be different. At least maybe her piano teacher can be the same one. And so we tried that, and I wasn't sure it would work. I mean, for all these reasons, right? At a young age, you sort of imagine it's harder to get them to sit at the piano and not move or run off, as the case may be. But as it turned out, certainly in the first few lessons that we had, she did seem extremely happy to see me on her tablet. And I think it was her weekly reminder of her life back in New York, and she livened up considerably. I mean, this is where it had me thinking a bit about the psychological implications of communicating online, because in person, for some reason, she wasn't all that communicative. Right, and I would be sitting next to her on the piano, and that's essentially how the lessons would unfold. But somehow, once I had her on on a tablet, she would be very lively, and the tablet was situated a little bit to the right of the instrument. So sometimes she would jump up from the piano, come to the tablet, talk to me, then go back to the piano and start playing, and she just seemed much more animated than I had known her previously. So then I wondered if just the physical presence of sitting next to her, being roughly twice her size, was in itself intimidating, right? And suddenly, by not being there any longer, somehow I had removed that lid, and she was able to be much more herself and much more expressive. So again, I wouldn't always assume that online is harder. I think that's one of the realizations, that I don't know that that's always the case. Now, there will be situations where it's true. It might be hard to maintain the students' concentration, right? It could be a matter of, in those cases, of shortening lessons, right? Maybe they happen more frequently, but it's not a full hour, but it could be 20 minutes here, then 2 days later another 20 minutes, right? So I think we all suffer to some degree from Zoom fatigue and the difficulty of staying focused for long periods of time. So maybe one solution there is to shorten the time. Another solution is to break up what you do within the hour, right? So have very clear planning. Again, we're back to that idea that the first 20 minutes we do this, the next 20 minutes we do something completely different. Maybe there's some sessions where you're reviewing recordings together, so other sessions where you're simply doing some writing back and forth, right? Or allow some time for just chatting, right? Just establishing that bond between the two of you, right? You talk about what is she doing in school, what does she do exciting that week, right? And constantly trying to draw them out, not keeping them so focused on the scales and the arpeggios and repeating and this and that, right? Just always mixing it up in a variety of ways. It's undoubtedly helpful to have parents help. And I think that's maybe also, in addition to all of these, really to have them sit with their child during the lesson, because at least there's some sense that there's somebody else there, right, physically there, and helping the student just remain on track. So if that is at all possible, I know parents tend to be extraordinarily busy these days. It may not always be possible, but if they can, I think that's generally also quite helpful. But yeah, I think that would be my main suggestions. You could have studio classes, right? And it doesn't have to be with all your students, but just 2 or 3. And that's one of the ways in which you mix things up, right? You bring different people, you have them listen to each other, and it doesn't have to be formal, it doesn't have to be a recital environment, but again, just a way of making it familiar, right? So, and now they have friends in music who may also live in other parts of the world. And just asking them to play for somebody is going to force them to focus a little bit, right? And they have to practice to get to that point. And so they will, be easier for them to work well, at least that week also when they're preparing for a concert. So I think that there are ways, online to keep the young students well engaged in musical activities.
Fantastic. Um, I would love to have people post in the chat if they have specific challenges that they've faced in the past few months switching over to online. I know one of mine. I'll just throw my biggest challenge that I've experienced is teaching and maintaining rhythm. For some reason, that has been a difficult thing for me to get across via
Mm.
screen. And maybe it's because I tend to be very physical in lessons, so like they're up and they're moving and imitating me, and somehow it's not translating as well.
Mm.
Um, so I wonder if you've thought about this or had any of these
Yeah.
issues or.
I mean, it actually came up in a discussion not too long ago that I was having with some colleagues. You know, I think the challenge with rhythm is that there's two aspects to this. There's one is just the meter in the background, which we don't hear, and then the other is the actual rhythm that we hear. And I think what I've generally found meter to be very hard to teach. Especially in the early stages, whether you're with children or let's say with adult amateurs as well, right? If they have no exposure to music prior to that, it's actually quite hard to have this sense of pulse, right? But I think, conducting helps a lot, right? Because that's the nature of the idea of meter, right? That somehow there's something in the background regulating how we phrase, and I think all of that can happen online in a way that's not necessarily different from what happens, offline, right? So I guess part of my question is do you feel like it's harder to do it online, even if you're conducting, if you're counting along, if you're phrasing along?
I think it has something to do with them actually being present. So when there is an issue, then I can engage right away. And sometimes, at least, I've found in online instruction is that I have to wait for them to be done,
I
and
see.
then we have to go back to or whatever the situation is, they have to complete whatever they're doing, and then I'm there
Yeah.
to engage instead of correcting as we go.
Right. So maybe in this case you can alternate, and again make that clear when you're doing the exercise, right? The student does it once, you do it once. The student does it once, you do it once, right? And that way you can, through hearing the difference immediately. But I agree, that's perhaps one area where it's still very challenging online is the simultaneous playing, right? And being able to do things very precisely. I mean, I was able to observe some percussion lessons online, and I thought they went extraordinarily well. And percussion is all about rhythm, and it's extremely challenging. It's split-second reaction times, and you want to see the baton exactly when you hear the sound, right? And these things can unfold extremely rapidly. So that was sort of the litmus test, especially early on when we were testing these online platforms, is can percussion happen, over the internet in a way that was credible? And I would say by now the answer is very much yes, right? So they're able to teach rhythm very, very convincingly. But I think there's some adaptation in that sense, right? You cannot count 1, 2, 3 while the other person is playing, right? You sort of have to do it in an alternating way. But otherwise, just more deeply, in terms of how to teach rhythm, I mean, I generally find that just making that distinction, right? What is the rhythm that we actually hear, and maybe that's something that one can repeat, but mainly getting students to understand that idea of the meter, right? And getting them to feel it, right? Getting them to conduct themselves as they sing or as they play, right? Play with one hand, conduct with the other hand. I mean, I think that all of that happens online the way it happens offline. And perhaps that's the harder element to learn especially early on, that somehow there's this thing happening in the background that's operating in the background that influences how music unfolds, and yet we don't hear it, right? And I think that part can be quite challenging.
Yeah, definitely. I think Chloe Weston had a question. Do you want to unmute?
Hi.
Hi, Chloe.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well.
Okay. You kind of already touched on this, but I live in a place where I've been pretty lucky, and up until now we've been in person, but I recently had to switch to online. So I have this little wee student, she's 5. And we had our first online lesson, and it was incredible because you're totally right. Her focus was better online, which was really cool. But maybe this is, it's kind of a rhythm question and also kind of a technology question, I guess, because when I would talk, like it would cut over her sound and vice versa. So like, is it just impossible to be making sound at the same time? And then as far as like clapping a rhythm together, that's just not going to work? Or do I turn on the original sound for both of us? I'm just curious how, or does it always have to be back and forth?
I mean, that's a great question. I think generally it has to be back and forth. So unless you're using a specialized platform, which really typically requires both parties to have special equipment, right? And it's plugged in directly into the laptop. And it's very hard to do that with acoustic instruments, right? So electronic instruments it's easier to plug them in. So I think it is hard. So perhaps it makes sense to have some adaptation there, right? So just have a very clear exercise and then have the student do it and then you repeat again, right? So finding ways not to overlap in terms of when you're speaking or clapping and so on.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are some, Eastern music traditions where one learns very much by playing with somebody, right? So almost the entire training is the master plays the instrument and then the student essentially plays along. And over many months or even years, one starts learning, So fortunately, typically in the way we learn, it's not quite as imitative, right? And I think there's a lot of benefit also to not playing at the same time, to the extent that the student can hear you better, right? So partly is directing the student to focus on what you're saying or focus on what you're playing, and really absorb that, and then try to reproduce. Right? So sometimes following along is sort of like the easy way out, right? You can and it sort of masks even what may be working, may not be working. So I agree. It could be a little bit more challenging, especially with kids, who like to follow along and like to learn by imitation in some ways, but I would say this is probably a worthwhile adjustment to make, right? Just to alternate, but at the same time be clear on what it is that you're doing while you're alternating, right? What is it that they need to be listening for, and then they need to focus on that in particular at that moment.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I mean, one issue I found just on the tech side with when those issues happen more dramatically, and maybe sometimes also when, even when the sounds are not overlapping, there's some disruption, often it can have something to do with the upload speed, right? So I think also the challenge of what we do online is that we not only need very fast download speeds, we need very fast upload speeds. And that's how we are able to hear what the student is playing, and vice versa. And I know for some reason there are many providers who provide extremely fast downloads but very slow uploads, and I'm not sure why that is. But if it really gets challenging, it might be worth calling around and to see if you can find a provider who has comparable speeds. So that's always been a big priority in terms of my own search for a good internet provider, is that the upload speed had to be on par with the download speed.
Fantastic. Also, Caden made a suggestion that you could possibly have the student mute and then play or clap with whatever you're doing. But noticing the challenge that you can't tell what exactly they're actually doing, so maybe there's not a lot of room for correcting there.
Right. So I think the assumption there is that visually, right? So maybe if you clap, the student can see you clap. So I would say the only thing is that it's very rare that there is no lag. Most likely, the student is not seeing you in real time, right? And normally we don't notice it because we only see our own screen. So even if the student has spoke 2 seconds ago and we only now hear them speaking, still in real life, if we could somehow see both parties from a bird's eye view, we would see that it's not synchronized. So perhaps it can work. I think it's worth testing, right? That the student plays, and while they're playing, you clap along. But most likely what the student will see is that you're clapping right after them. And then it might cause some confusion there. So, but by all means.
I'm not sure if the suggestion will help anyone, but I just wanted to share that sometimes if it's a very young student and they're just learning a new rhythm and you do some planning ahead and you actually record yourself clapping and send it to them, they can play it during their lesson and clap along. So you hear your recording on their end as well as them clapping. So the lag is equal, I guess. Yeah, that way.
That's true. That's great. Yeah.
Fantastic. If anyone has a few last minute questions, just go ahead and type them in or unmute. There's one question that I got here asking about, so you talked about concentration in lessons and how your experience is that actually students are more engaged online, which is similar to my experience teaching. I felt I was way more engaged when I was doing through Zoom, just to make up for that lack of personal communication. But this person was curious if you experienced a lower level of motivation overall while teaching online. Now that students are practically doing everything over screens, especially early in the year, they're at school online, everything they're doing is online. And did you have to do anything to raise motivation for your
Yeah.
students?
So, I mean, I can't say that I necessarily observed that. I think the main issue was really the time zones. So many of our students are in other parts of the country. I mean, not only the country, but the world. And many are in East Asia, for instance, right? So with New York now, that's a 13-hour time difference. So, I have several classes that meet for me in the morning, around 10 o'clock, which means that it's 11 p.m. there. So I would say there are more those types of issues where I try to be as understanding as possible of that time zone difference. And if people appear tired, right, it's almost invariably extremely dark on their screen, right, and they're trying not to wake up their dad or their siblings. I think that's where one encounters those types of challenges. But the fact that they're even on the screen, right, and they're doing their best with a desk lamp, trying to follow what's going on, I feel like that's a testament that the motivation is very high, right? So I think one of the things that actually, in some settings, I think precisely because of everything that's been going on, this schooling has been one of the areas of stability if, the classes are going well. And I think that's where, in some ways, kind of the responsibility we have as teachers has never been greater than during this time. I think it provides that point of contact at least once a week, sometimes more, where students sign in and they see somebody familiar, they talk about things that hopefully are interesting to them, they're engaged with their classmates, and once they turn off the computer, it's back to this chaotic world or a very isolated world if they're at home, right? So in some ways, I feel an added sense of responsibility to make these classes engaging, interesting, varied. I think one of the solutions to this question of motivation is really to constantly make it interesting, right? And I think that's where the burden as a teacher is higher right now, in that we can't just let it go. I don't improvise any of my classes. I don't just show up and say, okay, what we're going to talk about today. There's a lot of planning. I mean, I have spent an immense amount of time, hours for every lecture, for every situation, every encounter, because I think it just makes for a much smoother flow. It allows me to plan different types of media during the class. It allows me to anticipate more what students might be thinking and feeling, right? To plan situations where, organized environments where they can participate, right? They don't just sit passively. I hate cold calling, so I don't like to do that, to force people out of their comfortable silence, right? But every opportunity, even using chat as a way to draw some people out, right? I might ask a question. If somebody types because they don't want to speak, it gives me a way to soft call, right? I can say, oh, you mentioned this. What do you think about that, right? But as I mentioned, just those breakout sessions with clear asks and clear exits and appointing somebody to be the spokesperson, all of that gives them ways to participate. So I would say preparation is really, really key. Planning is really, really key. And I think also just more generally, it's just, I think sometimes, my leadership class, I do talk about how teachers are inherently leaders, right? Because one definition of leadership is that we influence another person's life. And I think there's truly is no greater role than that of the teacher in that respect. We're shaping young people. We're helping them become responsible citizens in the future, right? And develop their interests and passions in different disciplines. And so we now have this unique opportunity to reach them in their homes, to try to understand who they are as people, to draw out individuals in a way that might be difficult in person, in group settings. And also providing this lifeline for many of them, right, who are going through very challenging times. So I think it's both an opportunity and also a huge responsibility. And I think all of these tools really, really help. So yeah, so I would say motivation-wise, I haven't noticed a big drop, but I think we've all become much more sensitive to the challenges that students are facing, at home in their personal lives, trying to meet them where they are in essence. And I think, again, this online medium really enables that in a very profound way. I know where they all live. I know how it looks in their rooms. I can get a better sense of who they are as people as a result of that. So I think all of that has been really quite transformative.
What a beautiful way to end this session. I love that. Well, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you, JY, for being here. And we can do our little reactions here. There we go. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. And I hope we can continue this conversation. So, our story under COVID is not over yet. And there's the whole life after that. So,
yeah.
So good
well,
luck.
Wonderful. Yeah. Best of luck to you.
Yeah.
Reading all the books on your bookshelf.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you again. We'll see you all at our next session.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Tim. Yep.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.